Alright, so we're going to talk about parallelograms today. You need to make sure you read over these and understand these. There's lots of theorems. A parallelogram excuse me, is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. So first of all, the opposite sides are parallel in parallelogram. Here's our first theorem. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, its opposite sides are congruent. Alright, so what that means is not only are QP and RS parallel and QR and PS parallel, but they're also congruent. Alright, so in a parallelogram, all the opposite sides are congruent. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite angles are congruent. Alright, so angle R and angle P are congruent, and angle Q and angle S are congruent. Alright, so these are two things you need to know. Let's look at this example. Use the properties of a parallelogram. Find the values of X and Y. Okay, so here's the deal. What do I know about F, G, and JH? We just talked about it. F, G, and JH are congruent. So if they're congruent, that means their values are equal. So what that means is, let's go right here. What that means is this. X plus 6 equals 13. And by solving for X, you get X is 7. What about Y? We know that opposite angles are congruent. So Y has to also, not also, but has to be the same as that angle up there, which is 68 degrees. Alright, that's just using those two properties there. Alright, the next theorem. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its consecutive angles are supplementary. Alright, so what that means is consecutive means right next to each other. Opposite means you skip one, or they're not right next to or adjacent to one another. So consecutive, any direction. These two angles are 180. These two angles are 180. These two angles are 180. But opposite angles are the same. Alright? Here's another one. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its diagonals bisect. What does bisect mean? They cut them into two equal parts. So this PM is equal to MR. MS is equal to MQ. Alright? So let's look at this. Here's an example again. Given that this is a parallelogram, so they tell you it's a parallelogram, so all the properties we talked about are at play here. Find MH and FH. Well, you already got the answers here because I always forget to erase that. Let's think about it. MH would have to be the same thing as FM because the diagonals bisect one another, as it states up here. Alright, so that's MH. And FH would be 10, so you add them together. 5 and 5 makes 10. I always forget to erase that, so y'all got the answers. Now, the rest of these are ways to prove that you have a quadrilateral. Alright, a parallelogram. And it's basically the same things that we've talked about over. It's just looking at them backwards. You got two pairs of congruent sides, then it's a parallelogram. You got opposite angles are the same, and it's a parallelogram. So that's what these are going through, is the same stuff that we've already talked about, but it's just looking at it in reverse. Okay? Now, alright, let's look at some examples again. Find the measure indicated in each parallelogram. Alright, I don't know if y'all can see that, but hopefully you can. Oh, can't zoom in. Alright, so this says, what is this angle right here? Well, since this angle is 135, then opposite angles are congruent, so that's 135. They're asking on number 2, what is this angle right here? Well, remember, consecutive angles add up to be 180, so this one has to be 110. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles right next to one another, they are going to be 180 together. Alright, let's move on down here to number 5. What is this side going to be? Well, opposite sides are congruent, so this has to be 23. Opposite sides are congruent, so this has to be, was it 12.6, I think is what it says. Alright, so they say on number 7, if RT is 19.8. Find RP. So what do you think that'll be? 19.8 plus what? 19.8, and that will be 39.6. Why? Because this is 19.8 and so is this 19.8. So the whole thing, RP, will be 19.8. But let's move down here. Of course, it always goes to algebra. So let's look at something like this. Each figure is a parallelogram, so we know that going in. So how would we solve number 11? Well, we know that the two angles right here have to add up to be 180 because they're supplementary. So it would be 80 plus 11x minus 10. And you never stop right there. You got to set it equal to whatever it equals to, which is 180. Then you would need to work this problem out and solve for x. All right? So that'll be 11x plus 70 equals 180. Subtract 70 from both sides. That's 11x equals, divide by 11, and x equals 10. So all the rules and properties are going to be true here. So keep this in mind as you work on some of these examples and properties and stuff. So that's pretty much it about parallelograms so far. Parallelograms in themselves, they have several different properties that you need to remember. And again, all of those were just repeats. And the properties start here. Opposite sides congruent. Opposite angles congruent. Opposite sides are parallel. And consecutive angles are supplementary, or they equal 180. Bisectors, the diagonals bisect one another. Cut them in two equal parts. And those are the main things that you need to know about parallelograms. Merry Christmas.